Inspector Purbright, one quiet town, one brutal murder, one relentless inspector. The evening sky above Flaxborough had taken on the colour of weak tea left too long in the pot. A mild breeze rustled the banners strung across the town hall entrance, where a modest crowd had gathered for the annual charity auction. These events were rarely exciting, though they were much discussed afterwards, particularly by those who had not attended. Inside, the hall smelled faintly of polish and damp wool. The seats were filled with an assortment of townsfolk, respectable matrons wearing pearls they had not dusted off since the last harvest festival, elderly gentlemen who held themselves with the military stiffness of a vanished empire, and a few younger faces present mainly to mock the proceedings later at the Grapes Inn. On the raised platform at the far end stood Mr. Gerald Pennington, the auctioneer, a man whose natural tone of voice was one of perpetual exasperation. His spectacles flashed under the gaslights as he peered down at the catalogue, occasionally muttering as if the lots themselves had personally wronged him. "Lot 17, he announced, his voice clipping the syllables like a man trimming a hedge. A set of silver spoons of dubious origin, generously donated by Mrs. Calthorpe. Shall we say 5 shillings to start?" The bidding that followed was lethargic. Even those who raised their hands did so with visible reluctance, as though they feared the spoons might demand polishing from beyond the grave. Near the back of the hall, Inspector Purbright sat quietly, a figure of unremarkable presence in a plain, dark suit. He attended these gatherings not out of civic duty, but because small towns often revealed their truths at such harmless occasions. In his experience, people's casual remarks over a plate of seed cake sometimes proved more useful than hours of official questioning. Tonight, however, his interest was only mildly stirred. A few minor arguments over bidding provided momentary amusement. Mrs. Harbottle's scandalized gasp when Mr. Digby offered a penny more for a framed lithograph, or Reverend Pulteney's flushed dismay at losing a cracked porcelain jug to a woman he had once described, from the pulpit, as morally negligent. It was Lot 21 that brought a small ripple through the crowd. Pennington cleared his throat and announced, "A box of mixed curios, origin unknown, discovered in the cellar of the late Mr. Alfred Broom's antiques shop." The box, when presented, was unremarkable. Dusty papers, a few mismatched candlesticks, and what appeared to be a brass compass with a broken lid. No one seemed interested until a voice from the side called 10 shillings, in a tone that suggested impatience rather than enthusiasm. Heads turned. The bidder was a man few recognized, pale-faced, neatly dressed, and seated alone. His expression revealed nothing. There was a brief, awkward pause before another bidder offered 11 shillings. The pale man raised his hand again, this time decisively. 15. After a moment's silence, Pennington declared it sold. The stranger collected the box with a curt nod and departed through the side door, leaving a ripple of curiosity in his wake. It was a small incident, easily forgotten amid the evening's chatter, yet Purbright's eyes followed the man as he left. There was, he thought, a certain economy of movement about him, as if he wished to leave no trace behind. The auction concluded without further excitement. A few townsfolk lingered to exchange pleasantries, but most drifted away into the cool night air, carrying their spoils homeward. Pennington himself remained behind to settle accounts and lock the storeroom, muttering irritably as he did so. Later, as the hall stood empty and the banners outside flapped in the darkness, a single light burned in the storeroom window. A shadow moved briefly across it. A hurried, furtive motion, and then it was gone. By morning, that same window would be dark, the door ajar, and Gerald Pennington would not be heard answering to his name. Morning light filtered reluctantly through the thin lace curtains of the Grapes Inn, casting a wan glow over the scattering of early patrons. The inn had not been open long, but already a few regulars had taken up their customary places, like pieces in a well-worn puzzle. The smell of strong tea mingled with the faint tang of beer barrels recently tapped, and from the kitchen came the occasional clatter of plates as Mrs. Blenkinsop prepared a modest breakfast for those who believed a pint and a rasher could form the foundations of a sound day. Conversation, as always, moved in gentle eddies, drifting from weather to gardening, pausing briefly on the erratic habits of the postman before settling, with a palpable eagerness on last night's auction. Mrs. Digby, her cheeks still flushed from the thrill of a successful bid on a chipped jardiniere, recounted every moment with breathless precision to anyone who would listen. Mr. Farrow, seated opposite her with the air of a man burdened by superior knowledge, interjected at intervals to correct small details, such as whether Lot 17 had been silver or merely silver-plated. It was when Mrs. Blenkinsop herself ventured into the bar with a tray of steaming mugs that the first tremor of real news rippled across the room. She leaned over to deposit a cup before Mrs. Digby, and lowering her voice to a conspiratorial murmur, said, "You've heard, I suppose, about Mr. Pennington?" This naturally provoked a chorus of eager denials and sharp intakes of breath. "He's dead," she announced with grim satisfaction, like a conjurer producing her final trick. "Found him not an hour ago in the storeroom behind the town hall. The caretaker near fainted, so I'm told." And she paused to savour the effect. There was blood. The room reacted as though a stone had been dropped into a placid pond. Gasps, exclamations, and the scraping of chairs formed a brief cacophony before being subdued into the intense quiet of shared fascination. Mrs. Digby clutched her mug, eyes wide. "Blood, you say?" Mr. Farrow asked, leaning forward with morbid relish. "An accident, perhaps?" He was forever dropping things. Mrs. Blenkinsop shook her head with solemn authority. "No accident?" "Not with the way they found him. A right mess, so I've heard. Constable Grindle's run off his feet already, fetching the inspector and trying to keep the crowd away." At the mention of Inspector Purbright, the room fell into a brief, respectful silence. Everyone present understood that his involvement elevated the matter beyond mere misadventure. "Do they know who did it?" Mrs. Digby asked, her voice quavering with a mixture of dread and excitement. "Not yet. Though," Mrs. Blenkinsop cast a meaningful glance at Mr. Farrow, "I shouldn't be surprised if it's connected to last night's auction. That box of curios went in a queer way, didn't it? Some stranger from out of town snapping it up so sudden. Mark my words, there's more to that than meets the eye." This remark ignited a fresh blaze of speculation. Names were bandied about, motives conjured with the ease of long practice. The Reverend Pulteney, arriving belatedly and overhearing only fragments, found himself unaccountably linked to a rumoured smuggling ring. Mr. Digby, entering moments later for a quiet half-pint, was greeted with accusatory stares until he protested loudly that he had never set foot in a cellar in his life. Throughout this lively ferment, Inspector Purbright himself was notably absent. While the townsfolk embroidered their tales, he was at the town hall, standing in the dim, cold storeroom where Gerald Pennington lay sprawled among scattered papers and broken boxes. The expression on Purbright's face revealed little, but his eyes moved slowly from the wound on the back of the dead man's head to the heavy iron candlestick lying just beyond reach. The scene was, at first glance, straightforward. A blow struck with considerable force, the victim collapsing instantly. Yet there was an oddness about the placement of the surrounding objects, as though someone had attempted to tidy the evidence, but abandoned the effort halfway through. Constable Grindle, hovering nervously, cleared his throat. "Looks bad, sir." "Proper bad. Mrs. Blenkinsop's already told half the town, I shouldn't wonder." "Indeed," Purbright murmured. He crouched to examine a scrap of paper near Pennington's hand. It was a fragment of an auction catalogue, the number 21 faintly visible in smudged ink. Purbright slipped it into an envelope without comment. Back at the Grapes, the rumours had reached a fever pitch. By mid-morning, the murder had acquired embellishments worthy of a penny dreadful: masked assailants, secret tunnels, a fortune in stolen relics. The pale stranger from the previous evening loomed large in every account, sometimes as a fugitive nobleman, sometimes a foreign spy. When at last Purbright entered the inn, his quiet presence spread a hush more effective than any shouted command. He nodded politely to the assembled company, ordered tea, and seated himself at a corner table. The others watched him with barely concealed impatience, eager for scraps of official information. He obliged them only with mild observations on the weather, then rose and departed as soon as his cup was empty. It was only after he had gone that they realized, with mingled admiration and frustration, that he had learned far more from them than they from him. By afternoon, as clouds gathered over the market square, the whispers at the grapes had become a steady hum of intrigue. Somewhere among the exaggerations and half-truths lay a fragment of the real story, one that Purbright intended to uncover, quietly and methodically, before anyone else in town realized how close they stood to danger. Inspector Purbright's morning began, as it often did, with a quiet circuit of the market square. He walked without hurry, his gaze wandering over the familiar shop fronts and their various displays of sausages, umbrellas, and disapproving cats. The townsfolk nodded to him in passing, some with genuine courtesy, others with the wary stiffness of those who could not quite remember whether their last interaction with the law had been entirely respectable. The previous night's auction had already been absorbed into the town's collective imagination, embroidered and rearranged like an old quilt. As Purbright paused near the baker's window, two women behind him discussed the matter with the fevered earnestness usually reserved for scandalous baptisms or runaway horses. "They say the candlestick was solid silver," one insisted, voice rich with disbelief. "And the blow, it must have taken a man twice Pennington's size." "Or a woman with reason enough," her companion countered, lowering her voice dramatically. "You never know what people are capable of when pushed." Purbright moved on, his expression unreadable. It was not the content of the gossip that interested him, but its shape. Who spoke with certainty, who hedged their words, and who remained conspicuously silent. In his experience, truth seldom announced itself. It lingered at the edges of conversation, like smoke in an unlit room. His destination was a narrow shop, tucked between a draper's and a shuttered newsagent. A modest sign above the door read Pennington and Cobus, auctioneers and valuers. Inside, the air held the mingled scents of old paper and floor polish. Behind a cluttered desk sat a young man with thinning hair and a complexion that suggested both sleeplessness and nerves. This was Thomas Lyle, Pennington's assistant, and, as far as anyone knew, the only person who had worked closely with him. "Mr. Lyle," Purbright said with his customary mildness. "I hope I find you well this morning." Lyle started as though the inspector had materialized from thin air. "Oh, yes, Inspector." "Well, not well, you know, considering—" His voice trailed off into a series of gestures that might have been meant to convey grief, confusion, or indigestion. Purbright took the offered chair, folding his hands neatly in his lap. Must have been quite a shock to hear about Mr. Pennington's misfortune. "Shock, yes," Lyle agreed too quickly. He swallowed, eyes darting to a stack of ledgers on the desk as though they might offer rescue. I can't think who would do such a thing." He was strict, certainly, but fair. A fair man. "Strictness often invites strong feelings," Purbright observed, his tone conversational. "Tell me, were there any irregularities last night? Unusual bidders, for instance?" Lyle hesitated. "Not really. Well, there was that one fellow who bought the box of oddments. Came in just before it started. Didn't speak to anyone." "Ah, yes. Lot 21, I believe." Purbright's gaze was mild, almost sleepy. "Did you notice anything particular about him?" "Only that he paid in cash," Lyle said after a pause. "And rather hurriedly, too. I suppose I thought it odd at the time, But people do like to keep these things private. Purbright nodded as though agreeing. His eyes, however, remained fixed on the young man's hands, which fidgeted incessantly with a stub of pencil. There was a rhythm to the movement, roll, tap, roll, tap. It spoke of anxiety not wholly accounted for by shock. "Tell me, Mr. Lyle," Purbright said gently, "was Mr. Pennington in good spirits yesterday?
No arguments?
No unexpected visitors?" Lyle shook his head, then stopped, reconsidering.
There was a
disagreement earlier in the day.
over the cataloguing of some items.
Nothing serious.
He was particular about numbering. Particular, Purbright repeated. And this disagreement, was it resolved? Yes, of course, Lyle said, a shade too loudly.
I apologized, and he seemed satisfied. Purbright let the silence stretch. The ticking of a wall clock filled the space between them, each second measured and deliberate.
At last, Lyle shifted uncomfortably and muttered, "It was just one ticket out of place."
Hardly worth mentioning, indeed, Purbright murmured. But sometimes the smallest details have a way of becoming significant. He rose, offering a courteous nod. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Lyle. You've been very helpful." As Purbright stepped back into the bright morning light, his expression remained as blandly pleasant as ever. Yet inwardly he turned over the image of Lyle's twitching hands and the hastily dismissed error. A misnumbered ticket, a pale stranger, a hurried cash payment, threads too slender to bind into a pattern yet, but perhaps strong enough to tug at. Across the square, the Grapes Inn door swung open, releasing a burst of laughter and speculation into the street. Purbright paused to listen, his head tilted ever so slightly before continuing on his way. The voices of the town swirled around him like a current, carrying hints and half-truths. Somewhere within them, he suspected, lay the shape of a motive, and perhaps, if he listened carefully enough, the faint echo of a murderer's intent. The council chamber smelled faintly of furniture polish and damp wool, a scent that seemed to cling to every civic meeting in Flaxborough. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows in reluctant stripes, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily between the rows of wooden chairs. At the head of the long table sat Mayor Alfred Cobble, a man whose round face was permanently arranged into an expression of diplomatic concern. Beside him, leaning back with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to his own importance, was Mr. Horace Grieve, owner of the largest timber yard in the county and, more pertinently, a generous contributor to several council funds. Inspector Purbright entered quietly, his hat tucked under his arm, and offered a polite nod. Cobble beamed at him with exaggerated relief. "Ah, Inspector!"
Excellent.
"Do take a seat."
I gather you've been very busy since the
"Unfortunate discovery this morning." "Indeed, Mr. Mayor," Purbright replied mildly, settling into a chair. His hands rested lightly on his knees, his expression one of courteous attention. Grieve cleared his throat and leaned forward, the table creaking faintly beneath his bulk. "I suppose there's no point in skirting the matter. A dreadful thing, of course, poor Pennington lying there like that. But we must be practical, Inspector. The town can't afford a prolonged fuss. Bad for morale, bad for business. And, if I may say so, bad for the reputation of our upcoming summer fair." Cobble nodded gravely, as though these considerations carried the weight of scripture. Precisely. It would be most unfortunate if this
incident were to cast a shadow over our festivities.
"You understand, I'm sure." Purbright inclined his head but said nothing. Encouraged by the inspector's silence, Grieve continued. "From what I gather, there's every reason to believe this was simply a tragic accident. Pennington was known to be clumsy. The storeroom floors uneven, the lighting poor. He could have tripped, struck his head on that candlestick, and, well, there you are."
A sad business, but hardly criminal. Cobble clasped his hands together with visible relief at this tidy explanation.
Yes, that would certainly make matters simpler. A discreet announcement, a quiet funeral, and we can all move forward without unnecessary alarm. Purbright allowed a pause to stretch between them, the the kind of silence that invites others to fill it. At last he spoke, his voice calm and unhurried. An accident is, of course, a possibility, but there are certain
elements that trouble me, Grieve frowned. Elements? What elements?
You're not suggesting foul play, surely? Purbright's gaze remained placid. The candlestick, for one. It was lying some distance from the body, in a position inconsistent with a simple fall. And there was a fragment of the auction catalogue, number 21, found in Mr. Pennington's hand. I have yet to determine its significance. Cobble shifted uneasily in his chair.
That could mean anything, Inspector.
Perhaps he was merely holding it when he fell. Perhaps, Purbright agreed.
And yet Mr. Lyle, the assistant, mentioned a small disagreement about numbering earlier in the day. He seemed reluctant to elaborate. Grieve waved a dismissive hand.
Young men are always reluctant when they've made a mistake. I dare say he mislaid a ticket and feared a scolding.
No reason to complicate matters with dark imaginings. Purbright studied Grieve for a moment, noting the slight sheen of perspiration on his forehead, the way his fingers drummed lightly on the tabletop.
You may well be correct, Mr. Grieve. Still, it is my duty to examine every possibility. The law is sometimes obliged to linger where others might prefer to move swiftly on. The mayor gave a nervous laugh. Of course. We only wish to assist you, Inspector, but do consider the wider picture. Flaxborough is a peaceful town. People expect reassurance. If word spreads that a murder has occurred, well, you know how quickly rumours can grow. Purbright's expression softened, almost sympathetic.
Indeed I do. Rumours, like ivy, thrive on neglect.
Which is why it is often best to tend to the roots rather than merely trimming the leaves. Neither man seemed entirely sure how to respond to this metaphor. Grieve coughed, muttered something about the timber yard, and rose to leave. Well, I trust you'll keep us informed, Inspector, for the sake of the town. When they had gone, Purbright remained seated, gazing thoughtfully at the empty chairs. The neatness of their proposed solution troubled him more than any messiness of crime. A fall, a blow, an unfortunate accident. How simple it would be to accept such a story and close the ledger. But simplicity, in his experience, was rarely the same as truth. Outside, the market square was beginning to fill with townsfolk, their voices rising in a hum of speculation and concern. Purbright watched them through the window for a long moment before turning away. Somewhere among these ordinary lives lay a thread of motive, coiled and hidden. It was his task to find it, however inconvenient that might prove to those who preferred their town tidy, their deaths accidental and their consciences untroubled. The afternoon sun, half-hearted and watery, slanted across the market square, picking out the uneven cobblestones and lending a deceptive warmth to the chilly breeze. Shops had their doors propped open despite the weather, more in hope of appearing prosperous than to welcome custom. The square, never truly quiet, hummed with subdued activity. A cart creaked under sacks of flour. A pair of children skittered after a runaway hoop, and knots of townsfolk paused mid-errand to exchange earnest fragments of speculation about Mr. Pennington's untimely death. Inspector Purbright walked slowly through this scene, his pace unhurried but his gaze attentive. He had learned long ago that watching people in the ordinary flow of their routines often revealed more than a direct question. Today there was something taut beneath the usual rhythms, a faint but perceptible tension, like a string pulled just short of breaking. He noted, with mild interest, a man seated alone on one of the square's wooden benches beneath the bronze statue of a forgotten local dignitary. The stranger sat very still, hands clasped loosely on his knees, his posture neither relaxed nor tense, but peculiarly deliberate, as though he were attempting to appear inconspicuous without quite knowing how. He wore a dark overcoat of good quality but unfashionable cut, and his hat was drawn low enough to shadow much of his face. Purbright passed by without pausing, but his eyes lingered on the man's shoes, sturdy, practical footwear, polished recently but scuffed at the edges as though by travel. Later, as he crossed toward the town hall, Purbright allowed himself a glance back. The man remained on the bench, gaze fixed on the windows of Pennington's shop across the square. No newspaper, no companion, no apparent errand, just silent observation. Inside the town hall, Constable Grindle was awaiting him, looking harassed. He held out a small envelope with the air of someone bearing both treasure and trouble. So this was turned in by young Freddie Branks. Said he found it by the hall steps blowing about. Purbright accepted the envelope and shook out its contents. A single auction ticket, creased and smudged, the number written neatly in black ink. He studied it for a moment, then glanced up. 21, he said softly. Grindle looked blank. Yes, sir.
Is it important?
That remains to be seen, Purbright replied. He slipped the ticket back into the envelope. Where precisely did Freddie find it? Near the drain by the left-hand steps, sir. Could have been dropped by anyone leaving last night. Purbright gave a non-committal hum. The fragment he had taken from Pennington's hand that morning bore the same number, though it had been torn in two. That alone might mean little. Auctions were untidy affairs. But the coincidence nagged at him like a pebble in a shoe. He stepped back outside and scanned the square. The bench was now unoccupied. The stranger had vanished as unobtrusively as he had appeared. Purbright walked to the spot and examined it with the same casual attention he might give to a flower bed. A few crumbs of tobacco littered the ground near the bench's legs. He crouched, inspecting them closely, then rose with a thoughtful expression. Crossing to Pennington's shop, he found Thomas Lyle at the counter, pale and jumpy as a rabbit in a field of dogs. The assistant gave a start when he saw the inspector, then attempted a smile that faltered almost immediately. Mr. Lyle, Purbright said mildly.
I wonder if you might help me with a small matter. He produced the intact auction ticket and laid it on the counter.
Would you say this was written by your hand or Mr. Pennington's? Lyle bent over it, brow furrowing.
Mine, sir, definitely. I remember writing it out yesterday afternoon. And there would have been a corresponding half, of course, retained for the records.
Yes, sir.
Unless it was misfiled. Lyle's voice caught slightly on the last word. Purbright regarded him with placid interest.
Misfiled, I see.
And lot 21, that was the box of curios purchased by the gentleman who left so quickly?
Lyle nodded, his throat working. Paid in cash, as I said before. He didn't give a name. Quite understandable, Purbright murmured. Some people value discretion above all else. He let the remark hang for a moment, then added, Have you seen him since? No, sir.
Not today. Purbright offered a mild smile and pocketed the ticket.
Thank you, Mr. Lyle. You've been most obliging. Outside once more, he paused near the statue and surveyed the square. It had grown busier in the last hour, yet the bench remained conspicuously empty, as though marked by the absence of its former occupant. The hum of conversation reached him in fragments: candlestick, blood, stranger, murder. Somewhere beneath these scattered words lay a pattern, a misnumbered ticket, a hasty departure, a watchful figure with scuffed shoes, all trivial details, individually meaningless. But together they suggested a story forming just beyond the edge of sight. Purbright stood very still, letting the sounds of the town wash over him, until at last he turned and walked slowly toward the police station. He did not quicken his pace. A hasty step, he had learned long ago, was rarely a wise one. The truth, like the stranger on the bench, was patient, and it was waiting to be found. By mid-morning the following day, the drizzle had turned to a steady, misting rain that blurred the outlines of Flaxborough's rooftops and made the cobblestones shine darkly underfoot. Inspector Purbright moved through the market square with his usual unhurried tread, his umbrella angled precisely against the wind. To a casual observer, he might have appeared to be a man absorbed in nothing more consequential than the state of the weather. But his gaze was sharp, noting small changes: a shop curtain hastily drawn, a door left ajar, a face turned away too quickly. He had begun, as always, with the people most reluctant to speak. Mrs. Calthorpe, who had donated the silver spoons at the auction, greeted him with a mixture of embarrassment and defiance. Over weak tea in her overstuffed parlour, she admitted that the spoons had not been hers at all, but belonged to her late brother, whose finances had been, as she delicately put it, not entirely above question. The auction, she explained, had seemed a tidy way to dispose of certain items without drawing awkward attention. Purbright listened with polite interest, his expression neutral. When she reached the point of declaring that Mr. Pennington had been extremely obliging about the matter, he merely inclined his head and asked if anyone else had known of this arrangement. Mrs. Calthorpe, after a moment's hesitation, confessed that her cousin, an inveterate gossip with a talent for embroidery, might have overheard. From there, the inspector moved to the Grapes Inn, where conversation buzzed like flies around honey. He took a quiet corner table and sipped his tea while the talk flowed around him. It was remarkable how freely people spoke when they believed themselves unobserved. Within half an hour, he had gleaned 3 new theories, none of them entirely implausible, one involving unpaid debts between Pennington and a certain Mr. Grieve, another hinting at a quarrel over a woman, and a third suggesting that Lot 21 had contained an object of considerable value, though no one could quite agree on what that object had been. As he rose to leave, Purbright noticed Lyle at the far end of the bar, speaking in low tones to a young woman whose back was to the room. The assistant's posture was tense, his hand gripping the edge of the counter as though it were a lifeline. The woman turned slightly, revealing a pale, pinched face beneath a stylish but worn hat. Her expression was one of mingled anger and fear. Before Purbright could approach, Lyle spotted him and straightened abruptly, muttering something to the woman before slipping out through the side door. The woman followed moments later, head down, disappearing into the rain. Outside, Purbright did not attempt to pursue them. Instead, he made his way toward the rectory, where the Reverend Pulteney greeted him with excessive warmth that verged on desperation. Over a plate of rather dry biscuits, the clergyman spoke at length about the auction's importance to the church roof fund and how deeply he regretted that such a charitable event should be marred by tragedy. When Purbright inquired delicately whether the Reverend had noticed any peculiar behaviour among the attendees, Pulteney coughed and admitted that Mrs. Digby
had been in high spirits, which might
explain her enthusiastic bidding on a cracked teapot. It was only when pressed further that the Reverend reluctantly mentioned seeing Pennington in private conversation with Mr. Grieve earlier that afternoon. The subject, he said, had appeared to cause some heat. Grieve had left looking flushed, and Pennington had remained behind, muttering under his breath in a way that suggested deep vexation. Purbright stored this detail away without comment. When he left the rectory, the rain had eased to a fine drizzle. Across the square, the bench beneath the bronze statue stood empty once more, though a faint impression on the wet wood suggested someone had sat there recently. Back at the police station, Constable Grindle awaited him with a sheaf of hastily gathered statements. "Sir," he said, "there's a lot of talk about that box of curios. Some folks claim it held a rare compass, others say there was a map, and one old fellow swears blind there was a ruby wrapped in cloth." Purbright's brows lifted slightly. "And have any of these alleged items been described with consistency?" Grindle hesitated.
"Not exactly, sir. More like
wishful thinking. Indeed? Purbright took the papers and leafed through them slowly. The lack of agreement told him more than any single certainty might have. It suggested that Lot 21 had become a convenient receptacle for the town's collective imagination, a blank space onto which everyone could project their own fears or desires. That in itself was curious. People rarely lied without reason, even if the reason was only to entertain themselves. He set the papers aside and drew out the auction ticket he had recovered earlier, turning it over in his hand. The neat, smudged number seemed almost to mock him with its simplicity. 2 halves of a hole, one found with the dead man, the other dropped carelessly near the hall steps. A straightforward explanation might exist, a mistake, a misfiling, a simple accident. But his instinct told him that behind this trivial detail lay a deliberate act. As evening settled over Flaxborough, Purbright walked once more through the square. Lights glimmered behind curtained windows, and the voices of townsfolk floated through the damp air. Somewhere among these lives, he knew, threads of debt, desire, and deceit were knotted tightly together, hidden beneath the outward appearance of respectability, like ivy masking the crumbling stones of an old wall. He paused beneath the statue, scanning the shadows for any sign of the stranger. There was nothing, only the steady drip of rain from the eaves and the faint, lingering smell of tobacco. Purbright's gaze softened, and he began to walk again, slowly, steadily, ready to pry at the first loose tendril that might reveal the structure beneath. Evening crept upon Flaxborough with a heavy stillness, a sort that magnifies every ordinary sound. Doors closed with a little more force than usual, dogs barked with sharper urgency, and footsteps on wet cobbles seemed to echo longer than they should. In the market square, the usual conviviality of late shoppers had thinned to a sparse scattering of figures hurrying homeward. It was the kind of night when people instinctively drew curtains a little earlier and checked twice that their latches were secure. Inspector Purbright had just returned to the police station when Constable Grindle burst through the door.
Rainwater dripping from his helmet and urgency written plainly across his face. Sir, terrible business. Mrs. Carstone's been attacked.
Purbright set down his umbrella with deliberate care. Mrs. Carstone, he repeated softly. The widow of Colonel Carston?
Yes, sir. Happened not half an hour ago.
In her own house, too. Neighbour heard shouting and ran for help. By the time anyone got there, she was on the floor, bruised and bleeding, but alive, thank the Lord. Says she didn't see who it was, only that they struck her from behind. Purbright's calm deepened in the face of Grindle's agitation. Alive is good. Have Dr. Pettigrew attend her at once and see that no one tampers with the scene. I'll come presently. By the time Purbright arrived at the Carstone residence, a respectable brick house with ivy climbing over its front, the lane was crowded with curious onlookers. Neighbours stood in clusters, murmuring speculation, their voices hushed but eager. A uniformed constable held them at bay with little success. Inside, the house smelled of overturned furniture and fear. Mrs. Carstone lay on the sofa, a blanket draped around her shoulders. Her normally impeccable hair had come loose, and one side of her face was mottled with a swelling bruise. Dr. Pettigrew crouched beside her, fussing gently while a maid hovered nearby, pale and trembling. Purbright approached slowly, bowing his head in polite greeting. Mrs. Carston, I'm very sorry for what you've suffered. If you feel able, I'd like to ask you a few questions. The widow's lips trembled as she tried to speak.
I didn't see his face, she whispered.
It was dark in the hall. I'd just come in from locking the garden gate when I heard a footstep behind me. Then a blow.
I remember falling, and when I awoke, everything was in disarray. Purbright's gaze swept the room, noting the overturned table, the scattering of letters across the carpet.
Was anything taken? Mrs. Carstone hesitated, eyes darting toward a writing desk near the window.
A box, she said finally.
Small, wooden with brass hinges. It held my late husband's medals and a few personal papers. Nothing of monetary value, really, but her voice caught on the last word. Sentimental value, Purbright finished gently. Yes. As Dr. Pettigrew urged her to rest, Purbright moved through the hallway, examining details others had overlooked. A single muddy footprint near the back door, the faint smell of tobacco smoke lingering in the air, a dropped matchstick on the carpet. He crouched by the writing desk and noticed a tiny nick on the edge of the brass lock, as though opened hastily but not expertly. Constable Grindle entered, his notebook already open. "Neighbours say they saw no one leaving, sir," just heard Mrs. Carstone cry out. One thought she caught sight of a shadow moving toward the lane, but it might have been the lamplight playing tricks. Purbright made no reply, his thoughts moving steadily like a river deep beneath the surface. The attack had disrupted the fragile shape of his investigation. Pennington's death had pointed toward motives of money, rivalry, and perhaps deceit linked to the auction. But this seemed of another nature, unless, of course, it was meant to appear so. He returned to Mrs. Carstone. "Forgive me for troubling you further, madam, but had anyone recently shown unusual interest in your late husband's possessions?" She closed her eyes, thinking. "Only Mr. Grieve. He mentioned not long ago that he'd like to display one of the medals at the summer fair. Said it would honour the Colonel's service." Her voice wavered. "I didn't agree to it, but he pressed rather hard." Purbright filed the name away, though his expression remained blandly sympathetic.
"Thank you."
"That may be helpful." As he left the house, the crowd outside surged forward with questions. Purbright offered a few calming words, but nothing substantial. Rumour needed no nourishment tonight. It would grow all on its own. Later, at the police station, Grindle paced restlessly. "2 crimes in 2 days, sir. Folks will be saying we've got a madman loose." "Perhaps," Purbright said, removing his coat with deliberate slowness. "Or perhaps someone wishes us to think so." He laid the recovered auction ticket on his desk, beside a hastily drawn sketch of the muddy footprint from Mrs. Carstone's hall. 2 pieces of a puzzle that did not yet fit together. The window rattled softly as the wind rose, carrying with it the muted clamour of the town settling into a night of uneasy sleep. Somewhere out there, Purbright knew, a hand had struck twice, once to kill, once to confuse. Which act had been the true intention remained to be seen. He sat very still, listening to the rain, until at last he reached for his notebook and began to write, the slow, precise strokes of his pen forming questions rather than answers. Somewhere among those questions, he believed, lay the first glimpse of the truth. The rain had ceased by dawn, leaving Flaxborough under a pale, washed-out sky that made the rooftops look tired and the streets bleakly honest. Curtains across the town twitched discreetly as early risers peered out to confirm that the world, despite last night's uproar, remained largely intact. Inspector Purbright, stepping out of his modest house with his usual measured calm, knew that behind those curtains lay more than curiosity. Fear, indignation, and a certain self-satisfied excitement were already brewing like tea left too long to steep. He began the morning not with the crime scene, but with people. For it was people, not footprints or fingerprints, that interested him most. The muddy mark left by Mrs. Carstone's assailant would fade soon enough, but the impressions left on human faces and voices tended to linger, given the right attention. His first call was to the Digbys, whose drawing room always smelled faintly of mothballs and overripe pears. Mrs. Digby, clutching a lace handkerchief, spoke at length of her distress at the general decline of moral standards. While she professed concern for poor Mrs. Carstone, her tone suggested a certain relish at being so close to events of consequence. "Imagine it. Inspector," she said, leaning forward, "in her very own home. It's dreadful, of course, but one must admit it has given the town something to talk about besides the state of the church roof." Her husband, sitting stiffly in his armchair, muttered that she ought to keep such talk to herself before adding, somewhat too casually, that he had always considered Pennington a man of questionable dealings. Purbright smiled politely, storing away both remarks. It was remarkable how often people revealed more about themselves than about the subject at hand. From the Digbys, he moved to the modest cottage of the young woman he had glimpsed speaking with Thomas Lyle. She opened the door only a fraction, her eyes wary. When Purbright inquired after Lyle's well-being, she hesitated, then admitted in a whisper that he had visited her late the previous evening, upset and fearful. "He said he wished he could leave this town altogether," she murmured, "that he was trapped between two men, one who'd ruined him already and another who meant to." She would say no more, and Purbright did not press her. Her fear was genuine, and too much pressure might make her retreat entirely. Back in the market square, life went on with a peculiar mixture of defiance and trepidation. Stalls opened, coins changed hands, but the conversations beneath the hum of commerce were sharp and secretive. Purbright paused near the statue and observed without seeming to. Mr. Greaves strode through the square, outwardly bustling and important, but there was a stiffness to his gait and a habit of glancing over his shoulder that betrayed unease. Mrs. Calthorpe, meanwhile, stood in animated conversation with the Reverend Pulteney, her hands fluttering like trapped birds. When they parted, the Reverend's expression was one of pained sanctity, while hers held the tightness of a woman who had shared too much and regretted it. Later, in the quiet of his office, Purbright allowed the fragments of observation to settle like sediment in a jar. Physical evidence was scarce and contradictory. The candlestick, the misnumbered ticket, the muddy footprint, all might mean something or nothing. But human behavior was another matter. That never lied quite as effectively as people hoped. Pennington had been a man with many small connections and several large irritations. Old debts tied him to Grieve, who preferred to present his dealings as benefactions. Mrs. Calthorpe's secret disposal of family heirlooms had given Pennington leverage over her, whether she admitted it or not. And Lyle, the nervous assistant, seemed caught between fear and desperation, though of what or whom was still unclear. Then there was Mrs. Carstone. Respected,
Admired, and until last night, largely untouchable.
her attack had upset the delicate balance of suspicion. If it was linked to Pennington's death, it suggested a scheme more tangled than Purbright had first supposed. If it was unrelated, then two dangerous currents now ran through Flaxborough at once, and one might be a diversion for the other. Purbright closed his eyes briefly, recalling the scene in her house, the nicked brass lock, the smell of tobacco, the hurried violence that seemed both deliberate and clumsy. It felt different from the cold precision of the blow that had killed Pennington, perhaps too different. As dusk approached, Purbright took a solitary walk past the Carstone residence. Through a gap in the curtains, he glimpsed Mrs. Carstone seated upright, her bruised face turned toward a visitor whose silhouette was unmistakably that of Mr. Grieve. Their postures were formal, yet something in the angle of their shoulders suggested old familiarity, and perhaps old grievances. The curtain fell back into place before Purbright could see more. He walked on without changing pace. In small towns, appearances were cultivated carefully, like gardens. But gardens often hid weeds beneath the neat rows of flowers. The challenge lay not in admiring the blooms, but in knowing where to dig. As night descended, Purbright returned to his office, where a lamp cast a single circle of light over the map of Flaxborough pinned to the wall. 2 pins marked 2 crimes. Between them stretched a space filled not with evidence, but with people. Proud, fearful, ambitious, and flawed. Behind their closed curtains, they told themselves their motives were private, their secrets secure. But Purbright, patient and persistent, intended to open those curtains one by one, until the tangled web beneath was fully revealed. The following morning broke bright and brittle, as if the rain of the past days had been washed away only to reveal sharper edges beneath. Sunlight glanced off the market square's windows, catching on puddles that had yet to dry. Flaxborough's rhythms resumed with almost exaggerated normality, though the stiffness of greetings and the glances exchanged between neighbours betrayed the lingering unease beneath the surface. Inspector Purbright sat alone at a small table in the Grapes Inn, a pot of tea before him and a plate of untouched scones at his elbow. He had arrived early, securing the corner seat that offered a clear view of both door and bar. To the casual eye, he appeared merely a solitary man enjoying a quiet breakfast. In truth, every detail of the meeting had been arranged with care. The table chosen, the timing precise, the tone of his invitation crafted to seem utterly innocuous. At precisely 11 o'clock, Thomas Lyle entered. His face was pale, his suit slightly rumpled, and he gave the impression of a man who had not slept well. Seeing Purbright, he hesitated, then approached, with the air of someone caught between fear and obligation. "Mr. Lyle?" Purbright greeted him warmly, gesturing to the chair opposite. "Do sit down."
I thought a cup of tea might do us both good.
"These matters, you know, are best discussed calmly." Lyle managed a strained smile and took his seat.
Thank you, Inspector. It's been
Rather a trying time. Purbright poured the tea with leisurely precision.
milk, sugar, excellent.
"Now, you mustn't think of this as an interrogation.
Merely a friendly conversation.
Tell me, how are you finding things at the shop in Mr. Pennington's absence?" The young man shifted uncomfortably.
It's difficult.
"There are so many loose ends. Mr. Pennington kept certain records in his head, you see. I'm doing my best to keep it all straight." "Quite understandable," Purbright said kindly. "I imagine it's especially challenging with the unusual circumstances of Lot 21. There has been so much talk about that box of curios. I confess I can hardly keep track of the theories myself." Lyle's hands fluttered like restless birds. The box was nothing special, just odds and ends. People like to make mysteries where there aren't any. "Indeed," Purbright agreed pleasantly. "Yet one mystery remains, the ticket. I've always found numbers rather telling, don't you? Particularly when they don't quite match." The young man froze. It was only for a moment, but Purbright noticed the way his breath caught and his shoulders stiffened before he forced a laugh. "Oh, that. A simple clerical error."
I was rushed, and perhaps I wrote the number twice by mistake. Purbright sipped his tea, saying nothing.
The silence stretched, soft and unthreatening, until Lyle began to fidget again. "I suppose anyone could have dropped the duplicate," he added, too quickly. "With so many people coming and going." "True," Purbright interrupted gently. "Yet the second half of the ticket was found in Mr. Pennington's hand. Curious, don't you think? Almost as if he'd been trying to hold on to it, even in his last moment." Lyle swallowed, his throat working visibly.
I wouldn't know about that, Inspector." Purbright leaned back, his voice still mild.
"What strikes me most, Mr. Lyle, is how very devoted you are to accuracy. Mrs. Calthorpe mentioned that Mr. Pennington could be quite particular about numbering. A misplaced ticket would have been a serious matter between you." Lyle's eyes darted to the door, then back to the table.
We had words about it, yes."
"But it was resolved," Purbright repeated softly.
A generous word.
"And yet, the Reverend Pulteney saw Mr. Grieve leaving Mr. Pennington's office looking distinctly flushed that same afternoon. Two separate quarrels so close together. It seems Mr. Pennington had a talent for provoking others." Lyle's breath quickened.
Are you saying Grieve? Purbright raised a hand, calm and unhurried.
"I am saying nothing yet.
I merely observe patterns.
For instance, the way Mrs. Carstone's attack seemed timed to distract the town, drawing attention away from Pennington's death.
Almost as if someone feared the investigation was closing in."
For the first time, true panic flickered across Lyle's face. His teacup rattled against its saucer.
"That wasn't me. I swear it. I had nothing to do with her being hurt."
Purbright regarded him with steady, almost sympathetic eyes. "But perhaps you can help me understand. The box of curios, you said it contained nothing of value, and yet you seemed remarkably eager for it to leave the hall quickly, purchased by a man whose name you did not record." "That's how it's done sometimes," Lyle whispered. "Cash, no questions asked. Mr. Pennington approved." "Did he?" Purbright's tone was soft, almost musing.
"I wonder then why he clutched the ticket so tightly."
"Why he risked angering you over such a small detail. Unless he had begun to suspect what was really at stake." The young man's face crumpled. His hands gripped the edge of the table as though it might steady him.
He said he'd tell everyone, he choked out.
Said I'd be ruined. But it wasn't fair. He was the one who'd schemed, who'd hidden things.
He broke off abruptly, realizing too late how much he had revealed. Purbright reached over and refilled the trembling man's cup as though nothing were amiss.
His voice remained calm, almost kindly. Drink your tea, Mr. Lyle. We'll take this one step at a time. Outside the window, the square bustled with life, unaware that a thread of truth had just been tugged loose. Within the quiet of the Grapes Inn, the trap had sprung, not with violence, but with the gentle weight of words carefully chosen, and silence even more carefully kept. The mayor's drawing room had been chosen for its propriety rather than its comfort. Heavy curtains muted the afternoon light, and a fire burned dutifully in the grate, despite the mildness of the day. A table at the centre held a neat arrangement of cups and saucers which had thus far remained untouched. Around it sat a small but telling audience, Mayor Cobble, stiff and pink-faced with apprehension, Mr. Grieve, exuding bluster edged with unease, Mrs. Carston pale but composed beneath her bruises, and Thomas Lyle, who looked as if one strong gust of wind might carry him away entirely. Inspector Purbright stood by the mantelpiece, his hands folded loosely behind his back. His expression was mild, almost sleepy, but his eyes moved carefully from face to face, gauging the weight of each silence. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice quiet but steady. "It seemed best to gather here, in a civil setting, rather than in my office."
Matters of this nature can be delicate, Cobble cleared his throat.
"Quite right, Inspector. Entirely proper. Though I do hope we can resolve this unpleasantness quickly and without, undue alarm." Purbright inclined his head, slightly. "That depends on our definition of unpleasantness. 2 serious incidents have occurred, the death of Mr. Pennington and the attack on Mrs. Carston. The town has been most inventive in supplying theories. My task has been to determine which, if any, align with the truth." Lyle gave a faint, strangled sound, quickly stifled. Purbright continued as though he had not heard. "At first glance," he said, "the 2 events seemed unconnected. A blow struck in a storeroom, another in a respectable home. Different victims, different settings. But when one looks past appearances, certain threads begin to emerge. Consider Lot 21, for instance." Mrs. Carston frowned slightly. Grieve shifted in his seat. Purbright let the moment stretch. "That box of curios," he went on, "seemed unremarkable. Yet Mr. Lyle was most eager to see it sold quickly and without record. The winning bidder, a stranger, departed immediately, and has not been seen since. The auction ticket connected to that lot turned up twice, once in Mr. Pennington's hand, once near the hall steps."
A curious redundancy, wouldn't you say?
Grieve grunted, trying for impatience, but landing somewhere closer to alarm. "Mistakes happen at these things."
All that bustle, people waving their hands about. Indeed, Purbright agreed calmly.
And yet, Mr. Pennington was not a man inclined to tolerate mistakes. He confronted Mr. Lyle about the duplicate ticket, and Mr. Lyle, in turn, found himself in a position both precarious and humiliating. "Is that not so, Mr. Lyle?" The young man's head jerked up. His lips parted, but no words emerged. His hands twisted in his lap like wounded birds. "Humiliation," Purbright said softly, "is often more dangerous than anger. Mr. Pennington held power over several people in this room. Mrs. Calthorpe's family secrets, Mr. Grieve's unpaid debts, even the late Colonel Carstone's military memorabilia. He collected such small leverages the way other men collect stamps. But he miscalculated the depth of resentment he was sowing." Mrs. Carstone's eyes widened.
Inspector, are you suggesting my husband's things, my home, were involved in this wretched business?
"Indirectly," Purbright said. "Your late husband's medals were of little financial value, but they served as a perfect pretext. The attack on you was meant to appear as a separate crime, an act of burglary or random violence. In reality, it was designed to confuse, to divert attention from Pennington's death. The box taken from your desk was never the true target. Mayor Cobble shifted uneasily. But why would anyone... Purbright turned his gaze to Lyle, who seemed to shrink under it. Because Mr. Mayor, Mr. Lyle feared exposure. Pennington discovered that his assistant had been siphoning small amounts from auction sales for months, perhaps years. A petty theft at first, but one that grew with boldness. Lot 21 was to be his largest deception, a non-existent item sold to a complicit stranger. The payment pocketed entirely. A gasp escaped Mrs. Carston. Grieve muttered something unintelligible. Pennington, Purbright continued evenly, confronted Mr. Lyle about this scheme on the day of the auction. He threatened not only dismissal but public disgrace. For a young man with little standing and few prospects, such humiliation was intolerable. In the quiet of the storeroom, words became anger. Anger became violence. The blow with the candlestick was sudden and final. No. Lyle half rose, then sank back again, trembling. He was going to ruin me.
I didn't mean to. I only wanted him to listen.
He wouldn't stop shouting. I panicked. Purbright's voice remained gentle. I believe you. The act was not premeditated, but once done you faced a problem. The ticket fragment in Pennington's hand, the stranger who might be traced, the possibility that others would see a pattern. You needed confusion. And so Mrs. Carstone was attacked. Not by you, but by someone you persuaded, someone whose loyalty you relied on. His gaze slid to Grieve, whose face darkened with fury and fear. Mr. Grieve, you have long been protective of your reputation. When Mr. Lyle approached you, speaking of Pennington's meddling and promising repayment of certain debts, you saw an opportunity. You staged a clumsy assault to create the appearance of a separate crime.
After all, who would suspect a respectable widow's attacker to be connected to an auctioneer's death?
Grieve surged to his feet.
This is outrageous. Slander, is it?
Purbright's tone remained mild. A neighbour saw a shadow leaving Mrs. Carstone's lane, a large man with a distinctive gait. And you, sir, were seen visiting her house only yesterday under the guise of concern. Mrs. Carstone gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Grieve's protest faltered. Purbright allowed the silence to gather weight before speaking again. You sought to protect yourself, Mr. Grieve. Mr. Lyle sought to escape disgrace. Between you spun a web of lies and half-truths. But webs are fragile.
A single tug, like a misnumbered ticket, is enough to bring them down. He stepped back, giving the room space to absorb his words. Lyle bowed his head, shoulders shaking.
I never wanted anyone hurt.
I just wanted a chance to start again. Grieve said nothing, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Mayor Cobble, pale and sweating, cleared his throat. Inspector, what happens now?
Purbright's expression softened slightly. Now, Mr. Mayor, we return to proper channels. Formal charges will be made, statements taken, and, in time, Flaxborough will resume its peaceful routines. But not, I think, quite as before. Outside, the afternoon light had shifted, casting long shadows across the square. Within the drawing room, the last threads of deceit had been gathered in, and the truth, however uncomfortable, lay bare for all to see. 2 mornings later, the square looked much as it always had, though the illusion of sameness was fragile. The stalls were set up with their usual displays of root vegetables, buttons and ribbons, and the smell of baking bread drifted from the baker's shop. Yet those who paused to gossip by the fountain did so with a faint reserve, as though each were measuring how much to say and how loudly to say it. Mrs. Digby, resplendent in her market-day hat, whispered to her friend that she would never again feel quite comfortable walking past Mr. Pennington's shop. Her friend, who secretly felt much the same, made a great show of scoffing at such foolishness. Across the square the Reverend Pulteney offered the same blessing he always did to those passing his church steps, though his voice held a little extra tremor, and his eyes darted toward the Carstone residence more often than strictly necessary. Mrs. Carstone herself had not been seen since the dreadful evening of her attack. It was said she was convalescing quietly, attended by a niece who had come down from Leeds. The curtains at her windows remained drawn, though occasionally a silhouette passed behind them. Even the briefest glimpse was enough to fuel another round of speculation at the Grapes Inn, where the patrons now spoke of her with the mixture of sympathy and relish reserved for figures at the centre of local drama. Thomas Lyle had been taken away in the early hours of the previous morning. The sight of him, pale and stumbling between two constables, had left an impression more vivid than any newspaper headline could. Some pitied him, others condemned him, but all agreed he had never been quite right for the position he held. Mr. Grieve, too, had been escorted to the station, though with greater dignity and considerably more muttering about his importance to the town's economy. The murmurs that followed this were quiet but sharp-edged, for Flaxborough respected success only so long as it remained unsullied by scandal. Mayor Cobble, meanwhile, had adopted an expression of grave fortitude, greeting everyone as though personally responsible for holding the town together. He moved among the market stalls like a benevolent overseer, accepting nods and murmured thanks, even as he carefully avoided any mention of the events that had so recently unsettled his community. Inspector Purbright observed all this from a distance, his hands clasped lightly behind his back. He made no effort to correct the stories that were circulating, nor to add his own. It was enough to watch as the threads of ordinary life wove themselves back together, frayed and knotted but functional. A small town, he reflected, could absorb almost anything so long as it happened slowly and politely enough. By late afternoon, the square had emptied. A few last customers lingered at the butcher's shop, and a dog dozed in a patch of weak sunlight near the statue. Purbright turned his steps toward the police station, his pace unhurried. Inside, the familiar smell of ink and old paper greeted him like an old friend. Constable Grindle looked up from his desk, clearly eager for conversation. But Purbright merely nodded and continued into his office. On his desk lay a neat stack of reports, witness statements, evidence lists, procedural forms. The business of tidy conclusions, each sheet demanding to be signed, stamped, and filed away. Purbright sat down, adjusted his spectacles, and began to work methodically through them. His pen moved in slow, deliberate strokes, as if the act of writing might impose order not just on the papers before him, but on the world beyond these walls. From the open window came the distant murmur of voices, the clatter of a cart, the rhythmic toll of the church bell marking the hour. Ordinary sounds, reassuring in their familiarity. They were, Purbright knew, the very sounds that masked the deeper currents running beneath Flaxborough's surface. Rivalries, secrets, ambitions. Today those currents were hidden again, smoothed over like ruffled water. But they had not vanished. He signed the final page and set down his pen. For a moment, he sat very still, gazing at the map on the wall where pins marked the places where recent events had unfolded. Two small, precise points in a town full of unmarked spaces. There would be other points in time. There always were. Outside, the sun slipped behind the rooftops, leaving the square bathed in soft shadow. Purbright rose, closed the window, and gathered the papers into a tidy pile. The world, he reflected, rarely offered perfect justice. But it did, occasionally, allow for a measure of quiet understanding. He switched off the lamp, leaving the office in darkness, and stepped out into the cool evening air. Behind him, the town of Flaxborough settled into its nightly routine, its citizens drawing their curtains against the world and telling themselves, as they always did, that nothing truly extraordinary ever happened here. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The end.